What's going on, guys? We are back with some major seeding stuff to talk about going into the majors, obviously, this weekend on Saturday and Sunday. NA in Europe, I think that's the right order. I keep forgetting if it's Europe or NA on Saturday or Sunday. But I'll show up, hopefully, at the right time, and we'll be good to go. So we'll see. But anyway, either way, let's just talk about how the majors are seeded. It's the same way that we have seeded all of the Swisses throughout, or the regionals throughout this whole season. Is it goes by your RLCS X points plus 1/3 grid points, and that'll come up with a sum. If you're not in the grid, you're just locked in based on RLCS X points. And that's pretty much it, and that's how we seed for this stuff. We'll talk about the importance of seeds in a little bit. First, we'll go over the seeds so you can see them, which you can obviously already see. I could probably zoom in more. That would probably be nice for you guys that are blind. So we'll go to 150, and then we'll go down to the grid stuff. All right. So here's how the seeds work out. We got Energy, then Envy. So Energy does flip over them because of their grid points, which they have a lot of. And then, Space Station G2 are your top four. Then you got Peeps. I'm sorry, this is supposed to be a 5. Then you got Peeps, Kansas City Pioneers, Rogue, Alpine is your next 4, which are important for round 1. Then you got Team Frontline, who was 9th. They were locked into that seed from RLCS X only. As you can see, they have less points when you add up everything because they weren't in the grid. So, but you don't really want to penalize that team for that because it's more about the representation of where your team looks like they're at over this whole split, so teams that do poorly in the grid, obviously, even if they have pretty decent RLCS X runs, they're obviously going to be power ranked lower because it's they keep losing to everyone in the grid. So that's the reason for that. Team Frontline's a team that we don't get to see that, so we only get to see them in 3 regionals, which all these teams also compete in, so we just want to compare versus those 3 regionals. So Team Frontline, that's why they're locked in 9. Then you got Knights, the Sonics, and XSET. And then you got E United, BOSEF. What is it? Board of Shadowy Figures. It's a mouthful. BOSF. So they're locked into their spot. There are only 2 non-grid teams that have made it. And then Ghost Gaming and Plot Twist round it out. Now, again, so a lot of people are going to focus in on the Swiss seeding for round 1. But it does involve a little bit more than that, where seeds are pretty important. But before we go there, I'm going to go over why these seeds are the way they are. So you've seen that some of these are a little bit different than what you would see in RLCS X points. So we'll just filter by that real quick. So for RLCS X only, you'll see a couple teams change. Like MV would be number 1. Then you go down the line. Like Peeps and Kansas City Pioneers would be ahead of G2, which is not the case because of G2's awesome grid performance. And then, a couple other teams flop around a little bit here or there. The Sonics, I think, move up a little bit. I can't remember exactly. So things like that. Platos and Ghost Gaming, they swap seeds 15 and 16. So the reason, again, is because of that 1/3 grid points, and Frontline and be a board of Shadowy Figures esports don't move anywhere. So here's how you would do it to see how the major seeding would work out. You rank them like this. You lock in these guys. You move the teams down to the grid-only teams, and then you rank based on RLCS X plus 1/3 grid points for all the other teams. So the way it works is like a team like Rogue, which I don't think actually happens in any of these scenarios. Let me see. Yeah, it really doesn't happen here, but it does happen in Europe, which we'll go to in a second. But if Rogue and Pittsburgh Knights, if we compared them and Pittsburgh Knights had a much better grid and they actually would have passed Rogue, then Rogue would actually fall behind Frontline. Because Frontline's going to be locked into 9 no matter what, but Rogue and Pittsburgh Knights would be compared versus one another, so they would flip spots, which means instead of only moving 1 spot, you actually move 2 because you're moving ahead of Frontline. It's a little bit weird, but I felt like the only way we could really lock in the teams that are not in the grid. So that's how that is all worked out. So you can see here, like Energy would be number 1, and yada, 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 down the list because of these grid points, which we showed earlier, which I probably shouldn't have sorted this because now everything's going to break when I sort again. But, yeah, I could probably just Control-Z it until we're back to normal. There we go. Look at that. I'm figuring it out. So that is your seed. Now, going back to the Swiss rounds real quick, a lot of people will focus in on top 4, then the next 4, yada yada, because top 4 play the bottom 4 in the first round, mid 4 or top mid 4 play the bottom mid 4 in the first round. Now, all that is well and good, but there is a lot of other seeds that are pretty important. The 4-5 seed, very important, or like 4 through 6-ish, because after round 1, when you're 1-0, you take seeds that are the top 4 of the 1-0 will play the bottom 4 of the 1-0. So G2 and Peeps, that's a big deal because that changes from G2 having to play like NRG, Team Envy, or Space Station to Alpine, Rogue, or Kansas City Pioneers, which is a pretty big difference. Or even Peeps, obviously. That could obviously change, like even Peeps to Kansas City Pioneers, because Peeps will be moved up into the top 4 if one of those top 4 loses in round 1. They would then be a top 4 seed. So that's why it's important to go down the line. The same thing on the bottom half, like 12, 13, 14, pretty important. Because if one of those teams gets an upset, they're not in this group. And it doesn't matter as much, I guess, down here, because if a team does get upset, the other team is ranked higher. In this case, it wouldn't matter as much. So the 12th seed of XSET is actually a little bit in a problematic spot because, like XSET, they would be considered top 4 if all the teams that are supposed to lose for that 0-1. But if one of these teams below them pulls an upset and pulls like NRG down here, then NRG would be ranked higher than XSET. They would be bumped out of the top 4 to the bottom 4, yada, yada, so on and so forth. Round 3 is also important for like top 2 seeds, generally speaking, because top 2 seeds cannot play each other if they go perfect. So NRG and Team Envy, like if they have a perfect Swiss 2-0, they cannot play one another because they will be the top 2 seeds, play the bottom 2 seeds in that grouping. So those seeds are pretty important. You could always go down the line once again, 1 through 3, Space Station, because if Envy loses or NRG loses in that 1-0 round, Space Station moves up to that top 2, and then they don't have to play one of those top dogs. Those seeds are relatively important. It's the same on the bottom. Ghost Gaming and Plot won't play each other. They'll have to play someone better. Then in the 2-1 rounds and the 1-2 rounds, it gets even more extreme where the seeds matter even more. So generally speaking, like if everything went chalk, it's very important to have the Peeps seed in number 5, or even down the line, like 5 through 9 could really matter here, because the way it works is the 2-0 teams that lost, they come down, they're in that top half of the bracket. If you were a 1-1 team and you win, but you're the highest seed from those 1-1s, you move up into that 2-1 bracket, so you won't have to play those hard teams. You'll play some of those lower end teams that came from the 1-1 round as well, because we need to even it out. So that's where seeding can be very important. And the same thing happens in the 1 and 2, but it's the opposite. It's the bottom seed moves down into the bottom row. So like a lot of people will talk about, 1 through 4, 5 through 8, 9 through 12, yada yada. But the seeds matter a decent amount. Now, obviously, we won't know where it matters until those rounds happen, but that happens all the time where, like, the 5th seed will barely pass, like, Pioneers. Like, say Pioneers and Peeps are both 1-1 for some reason, which is very plausible because they'll be playing a top team probably in the 1-0 round. Well, then the Peeps are actually going to jump up, and they won't have to play the losers of that 2-0 round. Say everything goes chalk, that would be Space Station and G2. So instead of the Peeps having to play G2 or Space Station, they get to play Pioneers, Rogue, or Alpine, while Pioneers, they have to play either Peeps, G2, or Space Station. So that's a big deal, 5 through 6 in that chalk round. So that's why seeding is important throughout, and you will never know where exactly it is needed. That's why everyone has to be seeded by 1 through 16. No ties are allowed because things can change. Moving over to Europe, let's go over there. There's a couple rules here that we have to talk about. So here's how the final rankings are. We'll go down to the grid seeding. So Dignitas is one of those teams that kind of gets screwed by this way of it working. And not really screwed because, like, they could have done better, like, obviously, like, in the grid. But say we rank just the grid team so things don't break by RLCS X points. They would have been 10th. And they would have been ahead of all these guys that are locked in, 11, 12, 13, Magnifico, Fadeaway, and Barrage. We'll talk about Fadeaway in 1 second. But Dignitas would have been ahead of all of them, and then there's a pretty sizable gap to the next guys. The problem is Oxygen did really well in the grid, and Dignitas did not. That's the main issue here. So Oxygen actually gets a really big bump, so going from 12, which actually would be further down, would be 15th because they tied for the very last spot, 15th or 16th, whatever. They're bumping up all the way to, I think, 9th, was it? Yeah, 9th, because their grid performance is so good. And once again, that's how we're ranking them, because they have shown that they could be a very good team. So we want to show the whole weight. And obviously, grid doesn't mean a whole lot in the grand scheme of things. Obviously, regionals matter way more. But when you look at 1/3 grid points over 9 weeks, that would be a little bit less important than just one regional. Because grid points don't go up as high, because regionals, obviously, there's more places. So most people earn more points in regionals. And then grid, obviously, there's 9 of them. It makes it seem like there's only 3 of them, which would be the same exact as regionals. But again, there's less points going around. So for that thing. So the grid is basically like maybe 2/3 of a regional. Like, I don't know the exact math behind it. But because of how good Oxygen did in that, and how bad Dignitas did, they still move up so much. Now, again, it looks like they're moving up a ton here, where they move up to 9th. But they only passed 2 teams, or 3 teams. So Libertas, Dig, and Seoul. But because of this gap right here, where there's 3 teams locked, it just looks bigger. And again, it's very hard to compare Magnifico to a Dignitas, right? You have the regionals, and there is an argument. Obviously, Dignitas did better in the regionals. But if we want to incorporate grid points, the only way really is to hard lock them in and then compare everyone around them. Sure, like, it might not seem the fairest for Dig, but at the end of the day, they could have just done better in the grid and not won, like, 3 matches over 9 weeks. So, hey, whatever. They dug their own grave here a little bit. So they're moving down a lot from 9th to 14th, or 10th to 14th, and Oxygen moving up from 15th to 9th. So that is the big swing. Now, Fadeaway technically played in the grid for 1 week, but because they were a late arrival, we did not want to compare grid points, obviously. That just doesn't make any sense. So they are considered a non-grid team. They were still playing for 10K, because obviously grid is more than just points. It is also, you're playing for money, right? So Fadeaway came in for the last week because Chalked disbanded, and so Fadeaway got a chance to win some money, but it wouldn't hurt their seeding, because then no one would join, because everyone's like, well, if I only get 1 week compared to 9, it doesn't make any sense. So that's why Fadeaway is considered a non-grid team here. The other consideration, Endpoint and Barca. The tiebreaker state, it is head-to-head in RLCS X, is the first tiebreaker, and Endpoint is 2-0 versus Barca. They finished exactly the same in RLCS X points, exactly the same in grid points as well. So they were exactly tied. So Barca, they actually had to play a tiebreaker game because they were worried about the promotion tournament. So Barca actually won that, but in consideration with our tiebreakers for RLCS X, Endpoint gets the nod there. So that's the difference between 6 and 7. And we talked about that could be important. It might not be important, but it could be important for Endpoint later on down the line in that, like, 2-1 round. It could also matter in the 1-0 round, depending on if teams get upset or not. So generally speaking, these seeds, like, obviously are a little bit less important when you're in those quadrants before, but they still could matter a lot, again, down the line. So that's how we're seeding, and here's the seeds. I don't think there's any typos or anything like that, so that's how we'll seed going into the majors. The majors are Saturday and Sunday. I'm actually going to look up, because I keep forgetting which one is which. And I got to make sure I'm on time. So, so I'm going to do that right now. So I'm going to look this up for you guys. I think the European major is on Saturday. That's my guess. Yes, it is on Saturday. So Europe is on Saturday, NA Sunday. So definitely come check it out. It's going to be a lot of fun. Also, South America on Friday. So if you want to watch some of that, I don't have the seeds here, but that is just RLCS X points, I believe. Pretty sure. There is no, like, the grid thing there. So it's just RLCS X points, and that's how they're seeded. But there you go. That's how we're seeding. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Hope this all makes sense. And then we'll talk about new things in Split 2. Things coming up soon. New formats. Maybe some new tiebreakers. Maybe some new rule changes. Who knows? They could be there. But if we do change anything, which I think is an ever, like, ongoing season, where between splits is when, like say we want to change anything, it's very likely that's where it'll happen, unless something is really weird. So go on the lookout for that. I'll probably talk about that whenever I can. So that's it for me. Thank you guys for watching. See you next time. Bye-bye.